discuss important topics. Great. Our wonderful graduate student leaders have organized a series of live panels and discussions each month, so make sure to keep coming for these. Okay, so I'm the facilitator for today. I'm Sanhita Shankar. Samantha, one of our team members, was supposed to do this today, but she had a personal emergency. So that's why you're seeing a new face here. So please don't be confused. Okay, so I'm Sanhita. I'm the junior co-chair of Motivation Graduate Student Committee. I'm a third-year doctoral candidate at McGill University in the Learning Sciences program. So I'm hoping to see all of you soon in a couple of months. That'll be fun. So we've got three wonderful panelists today, and just to get right into that, first we have Dr. Catherine Minks. Catherine Minks is an associate professor of educational psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. She studies how motivational beliefs affect student academic outcomes and how social agents like teachers, peers, and parents shape students' motivation. Next, we've got Dr. Sharon Zambran. Sharon Zambran is a professor of educational psychology in the School of Education at Virginia Commonwealth University. Her research focuses on the contexts that foster the development of motivation and belonging, and interventions to improve student motivation, self-regulation, and success. Dr. Zambran has been the principal investigator of several funded longitudinal, experimental, and mixed method studies that examine the writing context, writing self-efficacy, writing attitudes, perceptions of feedback, and writing strategies. Lastly, we have Elena Seeler. Elena is a fourth-year doctoral candidate in education, learning sciences at the University of Delaware. She's interested in mathematics cognition, learning, and instruction, with a specific interest in students' sense of belonging to mathematics and mathematics identity, as well as how these factors relate to students' mathematics performance and problem-solving strategies. Right, so these were our wonderful panelists. So discussion today will follow two broad sections. We have a few questions already prepared that we'll discuss with our panelists. The attendees will also have a chance to have the rest of the questions answered towards the end. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to stop the slideshow and get started with the questions. Great. I stopped share. Okay, anyway, I stopped share now. All good. Happens. No matter how long you get, you don't never get used to Zoom. Anyway, so the first question I have for the panelists today is, how do you approach structuring your work when you start writing? Do you use outlines or planning? And do you begin with a specific journal in mind? I'm also going to paste this in the chat. Oh, thank you, Kimiko. So anyone who wants to go first, you just go popcorn style here. Yeah.
I can start us off. First of all, thanks everyone for joining us this evening. So when I start writing, I do tend to have a journal in mind. I find that is helpful for a couple of reasons. So I think one thing is just obviously, writing. Well, okay, one thing is the word limit and the page limit, I would say, as well as the structure of the article. So there are some journals that have very specific structural, guidelines. Some of the really, really top journals like Science and Nature and those types of journals have a very different type of structure. So obviously, if you're going for one of those types of journals, you'll need to kind of abide by that. But even within other, journals, I would say the page and the word limits is something I've come up against a lot, and I find it's very, very difficult to cut down your paper significantly. So I do recommend starting with a journal in mind so that you have an idea of kind of how you need to write the paper. And then I think it's also just helpful from the perspective of if you've read other papers in a journal and you have an idea of what types of papers they publish and the other, the audience for that journal and that kind of thing. I think it can be really helpful in your writing your own paper. So I do recommend, having a journal in mind and kind of using that as a way to structure or outline.
I'll just add to that. Thanks, Katie. I totally agree with everything Katie said. I always start with a journal in mind. In fact, I start with more than one journal because it's not always that my pieces get accepted at the very first journal that I try. Always that's great, but I like to pick out a plan A, B, and C, so that I mostly when I get the feedback or if I get a rejection, then I'm already ready, have a journal in the wings waiting so I can just ship it right off. I wanted to piggyback on what Katie was saying about looking in the journal that you're thinking about for other pieces. So I am a huge fan of exemplars and I start every single time with an exemplar. So finding the journal that I think is the best fit for the piece that I usually write with my team. Rarely do I write alone. So um, the best fit is we'll find specific exemplars. And I tell this to my doc students when they're doing their dissertation as well. Like you eventually want to publish that, even if you're doing a traditional dissertation. So where would you be publishing that? What might you keep in mind? So thinking down the road, not only about journals, but also I love an exemplar, find a content exemplar. So what is there a in that journal, have they written about what are we writing motivation, for example? Is that a common topic? When was the last time that they published that? Because the editorial board is also something to consider and something I think we're going to get into later. So I find at least one content exemplar. I usually go for two, and so something related to the general topic. So I know I'm not barking up the wrong tree, basically. I know that they're more likely to publish my work because they publish similar work. And then I also find methodology. So a methods content exemplar, ideally too. So what I do then is just how did these people frame their problem? What were the different headings that they used throughout? And again, I give the same advice to my students getting ready for dissertation land. Like, go find an exemplar dissertation of with those same ideas in mind of content and methods. Ideally, when that is was your advisor's student, previous student. I'll throw it to Alina.
Yeah, I totally agree with what both of you said. And as a doctoral student who is working on her dissertation, I'm like writing all these notes too. I think one other thing that this question made me think about, and especially your answer, Sharon, made me think about was authorship contracts. So if you're writing with a team, talking about what journal you want to target together, and if you're the first author, you know, you might think about what journal might be advantageous for you when you're going on the job market or going up for tenure or something. But I think that agreeing on the team, or agreeing with the team is helpful. And I'm seeing in the chat, someone asked, what do you include in authorship contracts? What I've done in the past is decided the order of authorship and what each person is going to write. And that's like a tentative agreement. And it's been really helpful because a lot of people that I work with have families, have life happening. Like I have a kid at home. And so I try and budget my time very strictly. And so if I know what I'm writing, I'm able to figure out exactly how much time I need for it. Whereas if people are just like spending all of their time on a paper and then they don't get the authorship position they want, it feels it's a little tricky. So I've used I could put some examples of what I've used in the chat, but it's worked well so far.
I'm so curious, Katie, what you do, but I have never written an authorship contract in my life. So would be curious what that looks like, mostly because I talk to I talk to my team early on and often. These conversations are not always super fun. They're pretty awkward most of the time. But I kind of curious what the word, how you, now I'm getting super nerdy. How are you operationalizing contract? Because it can really change. And so that's what, if I'm first author, that's what I'm emphasizing. Like, okay, so today, if we were to, have our druthers, I don't know what that means, what a druther is, but if we could say what we want, how much time and effort, what we want to contribute, where do we feel like we align? And I think that that's best done and led by what I think you're saying, Alina, is the first author has those conversations individually, because it can get extra awkward. And what you don't need is more awkward if you have a group, like a group email or a group chat about it, or even in person, people are like, I don't know. And then there's power differentials at play there too. So I try to like embrace the awkwardness. I name it for the group, especially if they're new to the writing team, and then say that we're just going to keep talking about it and know that it's flexible.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it needs to be like a written contract. I think just having those conversations in
Mhm.
whatever way it works out to be
Mhm.
can be really helpful.
Mhm. I do think there's something interesting. I've never thought about writing it down really. I mean, we do eventually just like we write the order down, like the tentative rough order and maybe what people are thinking that they're going to do. But that's about as far as like that's about as intricate of details that we get into writing that. So I'd be curious if folks do have something more elaborate.
Thank you so much. Alina, if you could share an authorship contract, I think all of us are just super curious to see what
Yeah,
that
I'm looking for one now.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. In the meantime, I can get the next question. So the next question is about journal fit. So how do you decide which journal is the best fit for your research? Can you speak to the importance of journal reputation and or ranking? And how does that then influence your decisions? And also, how do you think that affects the way your work is received? So there's a lot of sub questions, but it kind of gets at the same idea.
There's a lot of questions here, so I'll like maybe tackle some of it and then I'll let the other panelists, speak to other pieces maybe that speak to them. It is really hard, I will say, to figure out fit. I feel like sometimes I'm really confident in a journal being a good fit, and then it gets desk rejected because the editor does not think it was a good fit. And so I'm not necessarily, I think even having more experience doesn't always mean you're necessarily better at figuring that out. I think that the big things, so back to what Sharon was talking about with an exemplar, I think that is really helpful in understanding whether it's a good fit in terms of scope of topic. And then I think as well as like methodology, because I think methodology is a big reason that papers I've had in the past have been desk rejected. So for example, I do think a lot of the more higher impact journals, like let's say Journal of Educational Psychology, they're going to really look for really strong methods. And so if I am submitting a paper that is maybe cross-sectional data when I'm trying to understand some sort of process, but my data is not really that great for that question, maybe it, is still an interesting paper, it contributes something, but it's not really the most ideal data set. It might get like rejected. It might not be a good fit, right, for that journal. And so I do think there's a little bit of navigating like impact factor as far as like the strength of the data set that you have and the consistency of your findings. Unfortunately, I do still think that is a thing. So if you have a bunch of studies and they all have really different things, it might be a little bit harder to get it into one of those, top journals. And so I do think there's some, decision making around that. And I will say, I think that impact and I don't think impact is necessarily is exactly correlated with impact factor. So in other words, like I think there are still articles that can make a really big impact and can be read widely. that are at journals that might not have like the highest impact factor. But I do feel like I should be transparent that at least at UT Austin, I just went through the tenure process, and part of my tenure package was a whole PDF of all the impact factors and all the journals and showing the strength of those journals. And so I do think from like an external evaluation perspective, they do want to see a diversity of different journal impact factors, and they want to see that you're publishing in some of those journals. But that being said, I think some of my papers that I'm proudest of, that I think made the strongest impact, are not necessarily in the highest impact journals. And I think that people who are interested in your work and your topic will still read your papers, in other, like in journals that aren't as high impact. I think fit is probably a better, like if it fits with the scope of that journal and the topic, it's a better thing to focus on than the impact factor per se.
I totally agree, Katie. I think you do have to consider the impact factor. Kind of unfortunately, what Katie is saying is that is a very very common thing that reviewers look for in the tenure and promotion process. At all levels. So they still ask for that same table. Like you just have to keep growing it when you then go up for promotion again. So you just have to always keep track of it. And honestly, that's important at my annual review. So we still have to report impact factors for our journal articles for each of our pubs every year where I'm at. So all that said, there's still some other things that matter, right? Like Kate, I really like what you said, like it's a personal thing. So I remember being pre-tenure and I was like, okay, well, I want to publish my work in this practitioner journal because when I was a teacher, that was a journal that was always on always in the break room, always on the table. People actually read it. Like I knew it had impact, but it didn't have an impact factor, but I knew it was important. And it was just important to me to have to have a balance of my scholarship and practitioner journals and research journals. So that influenced my decision. But I was very careful about that, and it depends on the kind of institution you work at and the kind of like what they're expecting. I would say most institutions, R1 institutions, I mean, really focus on research journals, and so my institution is one of those. And if I didn't have research articles to back that, they would be like, stop writing in practitioner journals. You need to do this other thing first. The only other thing I'll say that definitely comes to mind related to what Katie was saying about methods is you kind of have this like gut feeling like, okay, this work is like, how would I rate it like on a 1 to 10 scale? Is it like this is gonna blow people's mind and I need to be submitting it to the most prestigious journals? That's one thing that I consider. I want to offer that advice with caution, though. I think too often people underestimate the actual value of their work, and they're like, well, mine's not good enough. That's that old imposter phenomenon at play. So that's where the exemplars come into place. Like, okay, now I feel better about it because they've been publishing these other pieces. The one thing I think that also matters, especially for grad students and junior scholars, is time. So it takes a long time to get published in those prestigious journals. And so, and it takes often a little less time. So that's something I look for too, is it's often posted about what's a typical decision timeline. It's not necessarily to be trusted, but that's something that I take into consideration for my folks that are on the job market.
That's really helpful to hear. I agree with what both of you said. And the only other thing I was thinking about was my advisor likes to Katie's point and Sharon's point about early career scholars, especially potentially underestimating their paper's potential. My advisor always recommends shooting for a journal that's like maybe slightly higher than what you think you would go for. And then, if it gets rejected, it gets rejected, but it could get in. And so I've been trying to follow that advice and it's worked for her. So hopefully it'll work for all of us.
Totally. Just like, that sweet spot, of like just above, is really perfect advice because what if it does get in? What I remember, there was a piece that we submitted to a top journal, and I wasn't the first author. And so the first author was recommending that we go there. And I'm like, okay. And then we got a revise and resubmit that was maybe the biggest revise and resubmit I had ever received, but we did get a revise and resubmit, and ultimately it was published in that journal. So I had to eat my words of like, oh, I guess it could have been, but a lot of work had to go into that. So I really appreciate that you also just, even if it gets rejected, you get really great feedback because they still review it. If it's not desk rejected, that is.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I do think it's important to keep in mind that the review process is a bit idiosyncratic in the sense of sometimes it's just a little bit random, like who your reviewers are, who your editors are, and things like that. So I have found sometimes these journals that I think are like really far reaches, I'm actually surprised by how much they like the paper or how few comments they have. And I've also had the opposite experience where I'm like, this is a great paper. And then I just get rejection after rejection or get really harsh, feedback, even from journals that I think it's a good fit for. And so, a lot of it sort of also depends on like who you happen to get as reviewers, which could vary at these different journals. So I totally agree with the advice to shoot like a little bit higher than you think. I think that can work out well.
Yeah, and I think even for grad students in fellowship applications, the journal reputation does matter. So I think it makes sense to sort of shoot a little higher. You never know where you sort of land. Yeah, just playing a game a little bit. Yeah, and on the job market, right? So just playing the game a little bit, but also leaning into your own personal values is great advice.
Because
Yep.
even on the job market, sorry, Sunita, because
Yeah,
on the job market, if it's under review, and I go back and forth. It kind of depends on my advice of whether or not to list what journal it is under, where it's under review at. But for my students on the job market, I'm always like, yeah, put that journal on there. So they know that you at least think that it's that quality. So they know that, but it's not something that I would make public. But yeah, thanks.
yeah. Yeah, so our next question is about challenges. Have you ever faced difficulties with journal rejections or delays in the submission process? And if so, how did you handle these challenges?
Nina, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yes, have experienced this. My first paper that I wrote with my advisor took almost an entire year to get a review back. And I think that that's unfortunately not like atypical. We have in our lab have started doing a process of emailing journals if we don't hear anything back after 3 months. So I like put it on my calendar to do that. And that's worked pretty well. We've had a couple instances where like after we nudged, we got reviews back as well. And then in terms of journal rejections, I think I try and take rejections with a grain of salt and with the understanding that these people are scientists and they're trying to produce the best science and it's not personal. Sometimes it's if there's a misunderstanding, then maybe I think about how I can make my writing clearer. Sometimes if there are misunderstandings and my writing is clear, I can think about other ways to like emphasize the points that the reviewers are making. But I try not to take it personally. And to do that, I try and like when I get a rejection, distance myself from it for a little bit and come back to it in a couple of days.
Yeah, I think all of that is great advice. I also recommend nudging if we haven't heard anything after 3 months under review. And yes, I have faced many, many, many difficulties. It is not unusual, I think, of anyone who's kind of been doing this for a while. So, I don't think I've ever actually pulled an article from a journal, but I know of many people who have because it was just under review for so long, or they couldn't find a reviewer. Um, and that is really tough, especially as a graduate student, because you really are under some time pressure to get things out and get things on your CV, and it's really tough. So I think that's something to consult with your advisor if you're in one of those situations where it's like, you really have had something under review and for a very long time and you haven't gotten anything back. Um, I actually really now appreciate desk rejections because it's in a way, it's kind of nice to get a desk rejection, which if you don't know what that is, it's basically the editor rejecting the main editor rejecting your paper before it goes out for review. And often that can be due to lack of fit, or maybe they just don't think your paper, maybe due to the method or whatnot, is not a good fit for the journal. That can actually save a lot of time. So even though it kind of stings to get your paper desk rejected, it's actually not terrible. I feel like I appreciate that sometimes, versus going through, the process, and hopefully you get good reviews that can help you, but, going through a 6-month process and then getting the reviews and still getting rejected. So yeah, I definitely think, as far as the rejection, or the, critical feedback and rejections, I do agree reading it initially, but then coming back to it, because I think your initial response is going to be defensive, or at least if you're unless you're a really well-adjusted person who is just full of oh, this is so helpful, even, but I think later you'll maybe come to appreciate it a little bit more. And I find with rejections, especially if you don't get a chance to revise, it's kind of nice too, in the way of you can read those reviews and think about, okay, what's really constructive here, what is actually going to help the paper move forward. And then if there's something that's not very constructive or you don't really understand, you don't necessarily have to address it since it's not going back to those same reviewers. So yeah, those are just some random thoughts about that process.
I totally agree. I think that it's so hard to get rejected. Like nobody likes that. I don't know if you really get used to it. At least maybe I'm just like Katie, maybe I'm just not well adjusted. All these things are possible. But when I get reviews back, even if they're professional, I'm not talking about mean-spirited, because those exist too. That's not constructive. There's constructive feedback, and my response, I take a moment. You should never be like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to see that they've accepted it. That is rarely the case. It's almost always and please still do these things, or please do this Santa's list of things. So I brace myself that it's going to be hard, and that it's not personal. I love what you said, Elena, that it's about the work. It is not about you. And they very likely don't know who you are. It's about the work, and that's their job, is to review it. Even though I say all those things to myself, and I think I put myself in this right mindset, I read and I will be audible. I'll be like, what? You idiots, of course it was there. And so I think it's okay to have that conversation, alone in your office, or even with your co-authors. But that's a total normal response in my experience. Not only my personal experience, but my co-authors as well. Just kind of buckling up for it to be surprising at least. And then, like it's already been said, like put it under the bed, like, okay, I gotta go. Same way you would treat like a like the end of course evaluations that aren't like especially all glowing, just put it away. Let's think about that later. Review it and then like take some time to process.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, just taking some time because I think the first iteration of my response to reviews are always slightly salty and I have to go back and be like, yeah, I need to tone down and like calm down. But yeah, just one other thing that I think I've learned from my supervisor, just celebrate every small win. You know, putting that in, yes, celebrate that. You've got something back, even if it's a revised and resubmit, celebrate that. So I think because it's a long, arduous process, so just celebrating every small win sort of keeps your own motivation going through the process. Yeah, so next question, getting right into feedback. What are some of the most common types of feedback you've received? How do you approach feedback that you disagree with or find difficult to understand from the reviewer? Is that
I think this is I'm gonna read it. I think the most common feedback that I receive on the work is constructive through and through. I might not understand it, and that's totally happens. And I think in all cases where I don't understand, or when there is sometimes the reviewers, it's important that the editors usually, or the managing editor usually catches these, or you would hope that they would catch these, but they don't always. When reviewers give conflicting advice, then you're like, I can't do both of these things, sir. So what do you want me to do? Then I ask, you just ask. So, and you say like, I don't understand what this means, just ask. Then the editor is always happy to, the managing editor you're working with is happy to answer those questions.
Yeah, I would say, so I think I agree definitely with Sharon on the like difficult to understand. And I sometimes in my letter, so when you get like a revise and resubmit, you'll submit, when you resubmit your manuscript, you'll submit a letter, and typically they want you to respond to every single reviewer comment. And sometimes I am just very honest in, in that letter if I'm like, I'm not entirely sure, like if I understand the issue, but here's what I think is the issue and here's how I'm going to address it. I'm just like very kind of explicit in like kind of my thought process. And uh, so I find that, I don't know if that's how you're supposed to do it, but that's kind of how I typically do it. Now, if it's something I disagree with, I also just want to note, and I tell my students this too, like you do not have to do everything that the reviewers ask you to do. It's obviously good to think about it and not to immediately dismiss it or that kind of thing. But if you genuinely don't agree, like say for example, a reviewer says, oh, you should use this analysis instead of this analysis, right? That happens a lot with like quantitative research. So that's a really common thing that I'll get is, why didn't you use, I don't know, like this like path analysis instead of whatever, like I think you should use this. I think obviously if you agree with the reviewer and you're like, actually, that's a good point, I should have used that, you can go ahead and address that. But if you don't agree with it, I think it's perfectly fine to, respectfully sort of disagree with the reviewer and say like, well, here's why I think this way is better. Um, and so I would say that's totally fine to do. But I think responding to reviewer comments in a nice, polite way is something you sort of learn to do through, I think, like working with your advisor, more senior researchers, kind of how you might address that. I would say even if reviewers are very snarky to you, you don't ever want to be, you know, mean or snarky back. I just think that's a bad idea. Like it's not gonna, you know, give you any favors. And typically if what the reviewer is asking for, so sometimes they'll ask for like additional information, like they want you to add more stuff to your appendix and things like that. I really try my best to just give them that unless there's like some really compelling reason not to. I think it's always good to give more information. And then I would say another common feedback I get a lot is about your theoretical framework or your, you know, I just feel like in motivation, we love our theories, we love our theoretical frameworks. It's really important to have a strong theory, rationale, purpose, all of that. And I think that's a very common thing we'll get feedback on is like, okay, this wasn't clear enough, or you need to kind of address, you know, make this more you know, I don't know, tied to theory or that kind of thing. So, you know, those things I find, you know, you can kind of, again, decide how you personally, like, you don't have to do everything exactly what they want you to do, but you can kind of see how you want to address that within the context of your paper. Um, and don't, you know, don't be afraid to push back a little bit here and there if you really feel like that's best for your paper.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of your points. I just wrapped up an R&R last month that I did push back on a reviewer, and it felt really uncomfortable, especially as a graduate student. And thankfully I had more senior co-authors that helped guide me through the process. But I think in writing that, it was helpful for me to rely on, I was pushing back for a reason and I was citing the reasons, and it was not because I just disagreed with them out of principle. So that helped me a little bit. And also just making sure that even though I was pushing back, making sure the writing was very like polite. Yeah, the amount of please it or thank yous that are in R&Rs, like the responses is wild, but it's a nice way to do it, I guess.
Yeah, every single of to the like hundreds of comments, like, thank you for this idea. Thank you for this feedback. This was so helpful. Even if it wasn't, is like, even if it was snarky, I love that you said that. Like, if they're snarky, you know, when they go low, we go high. Like, so like be polite. Because it's not gonna serve you well if you're snarky back.
And I will say, from being on the other end of it as a reviewer, because all of us are also going to be reviewers as well, and we're going to be on that end of things. Um, you know, even as a reviewer, sometimes I'm suggesting things and I'm not necessarily an expert in that thing. So like first of all, I'm okay if they want to push back, because sometimes I'm like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like you have a reason. But I have had at least one paper where the authors didn't take any of my suggestions as a reviewer and just did not change a single thing that I had suggested. And I will say that was not great. I got it back as the reviewer, and I did end up recommending rejection because I just felt that they really were not responsive at all. I don't think any of you will ever do that, but I will say that does happen sometimes where, you know, I think you have to kind of be a little bit strategic and genuinely, I think every review, hopefully most reviews, have something constructive that will make the paper better. It is a good point. It is something maybe you missed or you could clarify. And I think just being like, okay, like even if I don't agree with everything, I'm gonna at least take some of this reviewer's comments and take it to heart and really try to address.
Yeah, thank you so much for really great advice on how to kill them with kindness, while also keeping your point across. Yes, so just sort of shifting gears a little bit towards grad students. So what types of support should grad students expect when publishing, with publishing from supervisors for like dreaming up studies or writing support, writing the journal, etc.?
I can speak for my experience at least, and I'd love to hear what Katie and Sharon have to say too. But I have found as I've gone through the program, my advisor has gone from a lot, like doing a lot of scaffolding to more allowing me to take more charge. So my first year, she basically like gave me a data set and helped me come up with ideas and introduced me to collaborators. And I was writing the paper, but it was a lot more scaffolded of a writing process. And now as a fourth year student, I'm taking more ownership of the data in the lab that I'm working on collecting, analyzing, and coming up with the ideas more on my own, still obviously running it by her. But it feels a little more like a partnership and less like, I guess less guidance. I don't know. There's still guidance. I don't know the word. Um, but I have also felt like one thing that's been really helpful is my advisor has really encouraged me to work with other people, both in the department and outside of the department, and build collaborations. And I think that's made my writing stronger. And it's also helped me build my network, which has been really great. And she's really facilitated that as well. And just like allowing me to work with other people, even if my assistantship or time is with her, working with other people as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally, your advisor, your supervisor should, especially the first time you're writing a paper, maybe the first couple of times, depending on, obviously what you research and kind of how many papers you guys are publishing in the lab, in your labs. Yeah, I do think that it's really helpful to have a lot of support at first time that you're writing the paper in terms of like, yeah, figuring out the journals, because you don't know the journals. Like I remember not knowing, like my advisor would be like, what journals? I'm like, I don't know. I mean, you do sort of know because you read papers in your classes, but it is a little bit harder before you're super familiar with the field to really know like what journals to go for. Um, and then things like writing response letters, or response to reviewer letters and things like that. I think that is definitely something you should work on with a more senior person who's been through it before, who can give, feedback. And, that could be your advisor. That I guess I should say that also could be other more senior people in your lab or other collaborators, other people that you work with, but someone who's been through it before and kind of understands some of those like norms and ways to navigate that. I would definitely say getting support will be really helpful, because you're not going to, it's kind of a weird thing. You don't always learn it in classes. You kind of just have to learn it through this sort of like apprenticeship model, how to do that.
I definitely agree. And that scaffolding looks different from student to student. And, it's not only where that student's at in the program, but their experiences. Sometimes, I would not say sometimes, a lot of the time, it's about their confidence. So their like efficacy and they're feeling like they can do this. And I feel like a lot of my job, especially early on, but for some throughout, is just reminding them like, stuff, you got this. And um so I think that's a big part of it. But I also think that it's that I totally agree with getting multiple collaborators, getting feedback from multiple people. And this might surprise you, but I tell my students to find exemplars for whatever they're doing. So like, yeah, here's how you write the letter. Here's an exemplar, frame it like this, and just like fill in the blanks kind of thing, so that they're not starting from square one. So that scaffolding just looks like me often just doing a think aloud, or my more senior students doing a think aloud of like what they're doing, what their process is. And then often it's my senior students who are like, oh, I wrote one of those letters, I can give it to you, which is always nice to have that. But exemplars through and through.
Thank you. Okay, so I think next question is, what advice would you give to grad students about handling the pressures of peer review, especially when facing rejection or critical comments?
I can take this one first. I think this goes to what Kimiko was saying earlier about being surprised that someone was congratulating her for her revise and resubmit. I think that's also part of the scaffolding that I try to provide for my students, is that it's not normal for that to not happen. So to expect a revise and resubmit, and to look out that language is sometimes really wonky at journals. So it's like reject but encourage to resubmit, or possibility to resubmit. It's just wonky sometimes, and I would just take that as the most generous way you can think of whenever it comes, because if it's not an outright reject, then you're saying there's a chance, like, so and that's a win. It's a win. So you have an opportunity to make changes and try again.
Yeah, I would say it is really tough as you're first going through this process. I think, I don't know, I do, unlike what Sharon was saying, I do think it gets easier, in my opinion. I think I much better handle it now than I did at the very beginning. And I think part of that is just also knowing it is very normal, and anyone that you see that you admire as a researcher who has an amazing CV and has all of these papers has had many, many, many rejections, and many, many, many revise and resubmits as well, and has gotten many critical comments about their work. And that is completely normal and completely part of the process. Um, and so I think that is helpful. Just obviously, it still stings to receive critical comments about your work. And I know sometimes graduate students, and honestly, all of us, feel like overwhelmed even getting an R&R if it has so many critical comments that you're like, oh my gosh, like, did they even like the paper? Like, why did they let me resubmit? Because it sounds like they hated it. And so, I think what I would say is the best kind of things that I've found is I usually like copy paste the reviews into a Google Doc, and I will kind of do my first like pass of like snarky responses in like a Google Doc that maybe no one will see, or maybe like just one or two other co-authors, where I'm kind of like, what is this? I don't understand, or like whatever, or I think this is unfair, or like those snarky comments. And then what I do
Mine are
find is
so
really
much more
helpful is,
colorful, Katie, than that. In my document.
I mean, maybe it's a little bit more, but just kind of like those immediate reaction sometimes where you're like, oh my God, like, what is this reviewer talking about? I don't understand. But then I find it's really, really helpful to have a meeting with my co-authors and going through piece by piece, and knowing, it's a little bit, you kind of just have to break it down into the component pieces, because it's really overwhelming, of like, okay, what is this comment saying? What are we going to do about it? Talking it through with your co-authors, and then getting some support from them as well, to be like, yeah, isn't this person crazy? Okay, whatever. Let's figure out how we're going to address it. And then the other thing I think is just important to keep in mind, that I have to remind myself a lot too, is like, peer review is really difficult, and it's hard to get reviewers. And actually, it is, it's, um, it's very helpful that somebody took the time to read your paper and to give you feedback. And that is something where they are volunteering their time. They're not getting much out of that from their like job perspective. And there's usually something helpful. I think every single paper I've ever written has benefited from the peer review process in some way. It turned out to be a better paper because of the process. And so just reminding yourself, like, this person took the time to give me feedback. I think they genuinely want it to be better. Hopefully I want it to be better. And like, that kind of helps, I think, as well, to just reframe a little bit.
I love that. And so I wrote a chapter on this in my book about the feedback process, and in that is like hard to remember sometimes, but so critical to remember that all feedback is love, all of it, even the ones that hurt, it's all love, because it's unless it's mean spirited, that's the only feedback that's not love. Because so as as an advisor or even as an instructor, I'm taking, an hour or 2 hours of my time to really thoroughly go through this work. That is love, y'all, like big time love. And I might not say everything is like kind and have like heart emojis on everything, because I kind of get into a zone when I'm giving feedback, but it is still love because it's about making the work better. And so keeping that in mind when you're getting your reviews back. I I also I um uh so I blah. I'm sorry, I taught for 3 hours right before this, so forgive me, friends. Um, I also wanted to say Katie's structure for what she does and like how she approaches that her process for like what are we going to do for each reviewer comment, who's going to do it, what's our plan. I have a similar process, but I do it in Excel. I take every single comment and it's a line, and then I have columns and like I honestly have a column for the snark, but like, so just like comments. And then I have a column for, um, uh, a column for our plan and a column for and now like what we did / how are we going to write about it in the letter, and then who's responsible for tackling it and who's going to help that person tackle that part. So that is I don't think it's actually a smart column, but it's like a comments column, but it does end up sometimes. I mean, if I'm on there first, it's definitely a snark column, at least for a while. But yeah, I find that that's been really helpful and makes the letter easier to write. And pro tip for folks who are first author, you have to write the letter, right? And so if you have this spreadsheet kind of thing, then whoever tackled it, then you can say, hey, after you tackle it, will you just write how you tackled it? Because then you might need to finesse that language, but it's there already written. It makes the letter so much easier to read because let me tell you, if you get like, sometimes you get 4 reviewers, or God forbid, I have one right now that has 5 reviewers. And I'm like, you're kidding me. Like, that is cruel. I mean, feedback is love. Feedback is love. So it's a long letter, y'all. So that's the system that I use.
I love those pieces of advice. I was thinking about reactions to the reviews, and I think a natural reaction could be like frustration or upset. But I think as a graduate student who is becoming, but perhaps not yet an expert, it also can be really easy to feel discouraged. I think the first time I got reviews, I was like, oh, they're right. I don't know anything. And the truth is, especially if you're writing with a senior person or your advisor or someone, you do know things, and these things have been vetted, and you can still get a lot out of the reviews. But I think it can be easy to second guess everything. And so I think taking the time to say, like, just because you got these reviews doesn't mean you don't know anything. It just means they're trying to help make the science better, or they're trying to provide feedback to make this paper better. Reframing it a little bit has been helpful for me.
Love that advice, especially
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think,
go ahead.
oh yeah, sorry. I was just saying, I totally agree. And I think that, it's important to take, and hopefully you have a supportive advisor who is telling you these things that like, yes, you know things, but sometimes, when you read these critical comments, they're not always phrased in a way of like, I really believe in you. And it's not coming from a supportive person. So I think trusting your own advisor, the supportive person, over what you think these reviewers are saying, which is like, you're not good enough or something like that, is important to remember. Like, your advisor is the person who knows you and knows your, like, what you know and knows your work. So trust their opinion over like a random reviewer that doesn't really know you.
Yeah, thank you so much for great advice. And I think leaning on your advisor is really helpful because the first time I got a review, it was really mean, and I do not wish this on anyone. And it was really personal, but then she emailed me saying, you know what, forget the reviews, it's really personal. And just taking some time away from that and going back and looking at the content of the feedback. Yes, the paper did get better after incorporating that, but just like looking past the meanness of the reviews was a bit tricky. But yeah. Okay, so the next question is, what do you see as the biggest challenges for grad students in today's publishing landscape? How can they navigate these hurdles?
Okay, I can try to tackle this one. I think, you know, there's a lot of issues with the current publishing landscape, and some of which we don't have really control over at the moment in terms of like structural issues. Like I'm just thinking about, you know, some of the, we talk about kind of like best science practices a lot and using best science practices that we can, especially given like the replication crisis and some of these conversations. And a lot of the suggestions for best practices for science are often things that make your science slower. So they take more time to kind of do correctly. And I find that that is it's a big stressor for grad students. And I remember that stress very well when I was a grad student of feeling like you need to publish as fast as you can or get things out so that when you're going on the job market or you're looking at postdocs or that kind of thing, you have the strongest CV that you can. And sometimes ways that you want to do science or maybe the type of work that you do, especially if you're, I would say, like a qualitative researcher, mixed methods. Well, first of all, I think that work is not always appreciated at like some of these top journals either, but it also can take a long time. And there's a lot of things that make it feel like that work might not be like as appreciated. Um, I would say one piece of advice, kind of what Sharon was talking about earlier, is when you are, just remember that when you are kind of going on the job market or that kind of thing, you'll put on there your in prep or under review, manuscripts. So people can see what you're working on because people understand that this publishing process takes a really long time. I hope. So people on these committees that are looking to hire you or that kind of thing, hopefully can understand that and can see like the value of the work that you're doing. And so I think that's kind of one thing I would say is I know that the timing is a big stressor and things do just take time and they do just, yeah, they take a long time. So I think ways that you can, if you're worried about that next step of moving up in your career, ways that you can emphasize the work that you've done in like your cover letter, have your advisor emphasize that work. If it is a slower type of, if it's a slower type of project that's going to take a while, that is something that you can do to kind of mitigate against some of that time pressure.
I totally agree that like time is like the biggest challenge here. Everything just takes so much time. But I also think that sometimes folks don't use their time wisely as well. Like I I think some of my students get really excited about a specific project and tend to ignore the low-hanging fruit. They're like, hey, I know we're really excited about this, and I'm not saying stop, but can we focus on this, like revise and resubmit, for example, or this piece that's almost done? So getting those out sooner so that they just being like really mindful of where things are in the process and working with your team to figure out how to get things over the finish line as much as possible. And with that comes another really, sometimes a big challenge is working with other people, because most of the work that educational psychologists do is collaborative. So, and you don't always know who your collaborators are. And so I love, Alina, that you're saying, getting those experiences of collaborating with folks early on in your career, because that's gonna then I can work with this person and this is how they work and this is what we do. And I mean, I do have like, okay, I'm never writing with that human ever again list. And I think everybody does. And so it's sometimes you have to learn that lesson the hard way. Uh, and that's where talking to mentors comes in, of knowing when to like cut it or how to navigate that, because it's always just so idiosyncratic to the situation of why it's a tricky relational process. But Elena, I'm curious to hear like what your biggest challenges have been.
Yeah, I think that time is definitely a huge one, and just thinking not just about how much time I have now, but thinking about if I submit an article now, where will it be when I'm planning to go on the job market this fall? So where will it be then? Will it be a revise and resubmit? Will it be rejected and can I send it to a different journal? And so I have to start like doing a lot of forward thinking now. And I'm actually struggling a little bit with something we talked about earlier, thinking about the balance between like impact factor and trying to publish in like these higher impact journals that take a really long time versus trying to publish in slightly lower tier journals, but that get the process through faster. And I think there's a little bit of a balance because you do have to have some publications, but also, if you're saying on your CV where things are under review, that also can be something that could give you some credential too. So, yeah, there's a lot of challenges. I mean, I think you two both touched on a lot of the points that I was thinking about as well, but that was one other one that came to mind.
I think another challenge I just want to mention, because we've been talking about this in my lab as well, is, and it's related to the time issue, but sometimes projects just don't work out. Like the data just doesn't work. And, I think, for example, with my first graduate student, we did a bunch of like these experimental studies in her first year. And, we were, if I recall some of the details, we were trying to like have change like rate my professor pages and changing like the things that were on the page to see like in different experimental conditions to see like how that would affect, something else. And um, basically we kept like doing these experiments that we thought were like so great. We ran them. We realized that nothing came out like significant. None of our none of our hypotheses were true. And then it was only until like after we got those results back, we kind of realized, oh, there were all of these like critical flaws in the design. Like we would get these crazy like ceiling effects, and we're like, oh, of course we got these ceiling effects. It's hard to see. The research process includes a lot of like failure or issues and seeing what the problems are until you're kind of at a different stage. And so I think one of the other things to navigate is just, having some things not work out. And that's where I would recommend, and I know this is not always easy, especially given maybe the type of research that you do. So if you're in a lab that does like really high intensive data collection, it's very difficult to have multiple projects. But I would say to the extent that you can, I would have multiple projects going on. And like Elena is talking about and Sharon, having multiple collaborators so that if there are projects that don't really work out or that get blocked up in the publishing pipeline, you have other things that can kind of come through. And then I also think that that's helpful in taking away some of the sting of getting rejected, like a little bit, because it's like, okay, if you're only working on one thing that's like your baby and then it gets rejected, I just feel like that's could be a lot harder emotionally versus like, okay, I have all these like projects and I'm giving myself chances that something is going to work, something's going to hit. And, I know that's not always easy depending on the type of work that you do and your access to resources and data collection, but I think that is also something I'd recommend if you can swing that.
And that is not something you should probably just decide on your own. I do think it's important to like journal about it. Dear diary, here's what I'm thinking. But I think you should really talk to collaborators and mentors about that because it's a big decision and they can give you a different perspective. As someone who pulled the plug on an IES grant proposal that was scored and could probably get scored again, I had good reason to be like, I don't think so. I don't want to do this, even though, I mean, similar to a pub, those things take just a jillion years. And so um, I remember a colleague saying, like, there is a saying, like, throwing good money after bad is like not the way to go. And I was like, yeah, there is that saying. Yeah. And so like when to pull the plug is a hard decision, but sometimes the best one.
Yeah, and I think it can be really tempting as a graduate student to try and push against that. And so I agree that like talking to collaborators, talking to your advisors, like really getting different sources of input is important there.
I think as a grad student, it's also important to remember that these publications don't have to be your magnum opus. And it's okay, it's such a work in progress, and maybe they're just like not the best, and that's okay, and that's fine for now because you're still at an earlier stage in your career and you'll just get better from here. I think that's when that's something to consider as well.
+1, +2, I don't know. So much that advice is so true. I remember when my advisor told me, my doc advisor said, like, this is not your magnum opus. And I was like, yes, it is. Like, this is the greatest thing that I shall ever do. And y'all don't read it. Now now y'all are gonna go read it. So it's just not. And you will, as you continue to write, you will have a piece that's public that you are embarrassed about. 100%, because you get better. And so it's just, if you could just be like, I've talked to my students a lot about like #goodenough. Like, what does that look like? Operationalize it so that we can like get away from this perfectionist thinking so that we can actually get some movement on the pieces. So just want to +1 that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who are drawn to grad school are also overachievers and maybe tend toward that perfectionism, kind of thing. I think I'm actually not a perfectionist. I'm very much a like, this is good enough. And I actually think I try to help my students with that as well. And I know sometimes it's really hard to know, like, it's it's hard to know, like, when is this like, okay, no, this is not good. Like, this is not good enough. When is it like, this is good enough? Um, and then when is it like, okay, we're perseverating too much to try to make this perfect and we just need to, submit it. I do think that's a fine line. It's something I've had to learn over many years of experience. So I would, definitely recommend talking to your advisors, kind of trying to figure out where that line is. And yeah, I remember thinking some of my first papers were just like so bad because I could see all the flaws in them. And then my advisors were like, no, this is great. And they ended up getting published in good journals. And I was like, I guess they were fine. Like you're like, what is the word? Like your calibration is sort of
Yeah, it's
off,
off.
I
Yeah.
think.
It's totally off
At first,
because
like,
you don't have enough mastery experiences. So of course your calibration is off.
absolutely.
I think I'm gonna put #goodenough on my board when I start writing next time. Okay, I think we've spoken about this a little bit, but I think next question is about, do you have a writing/publishing pipeline? How do you manage it?
So I think it's it's really tricky. I think it kind of makes itself sometimes. There is there is a thing called momentum, right? And over time, they just then it's less up to you about what your timeline is and what your writing and publishing pipeline looks like because you don't really have a lot of control. I think what Alina said about earlier about, okay, if I can time it, well, I want, it'll take this long to get back reviews, hypothetically. And then, so I could have this. And it's just, the more you continue on, like everyone faces challenges with data collection. So you just don't know when those other challenges are going to come up. So I always just revisit it, like, okay, what's happening? Where are we at with this project? And I think what was said earlier in the chat and by the others as well, is just like have multiple eggs in multiple baskets. Or is it just one? Anyway, lots of eggs. That's the important thing.
I agree with that. I don't have like a strict pipeline, but I have like a individualized development plan that I like keep track of all my papers and projects that I'm working on. And I agree with having multiple eggs in multiple baskets. I will say though, it's helpful if the papers or the projects, I was going to stick with the egg metaphor, it's not going to work, are at different stages. So like I was at one point where I was doing like writing 3 papers and trying to do the analyses for all of them. And that was like, I couldn't do it. But if you have one where you're at the data collection stage and one where you're at the writing stage and one that's with your co-authors and you're working on something else, that's a lot more manageable. Or at least for me, it was a lot more manageable than having all of them at the same stage. And then that also helps with that momentum piece. If you're really feeling like running some analyses in R, you can work on that one paper. And if you're really feeling writing, a nice lit review, you can work on a different project. So having multiple projects at different stages can be really helpful too.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I have kind of and I've had this since grad school, but yeah, I kind of like have a system where I will like list out all my projects and what stage they're at. Um, it's like the writing stage, submitted to a journal, under first review, need to revise and resubmit, need to send to a new journal. So it kind of gets more and more complicated the more, kind of like what Sharon's saying. I feel like the kind of further along you get, it starts to get a little out of control when you have your own students. You're just like, there's so many different things. But I think as a graduate student, I just want to reiterate something Sharon said earlier, which is that there are ways to be strategic about what you work on next, or what, so that you can hopefully give yourself the best chance, even knowing that there's stuff out of your control as far as how long like review process will take. But if you have a paper that's really close to being able to be submitted, maybe prioritizing that over like a new paper. And then once you submit it, you'll have it off your plate for a little bit and you can shift your attention to other things. So you don't have to completely abandon your project, because all projects are going to have start and stop. Like you do work and then it's on someone else's desk, and then you do more work and then it's on someone else's desk. But I think prioritizing those projects that are like low hanging fruit, like things that are very close to that finish line, can be a way that you can give yourself the best chance to kind of be most efficient, I guess, in your time, and making things hopefully start moving along. But it does take some time to even get to that place when you're first starting out. So just having multiple things and then just trying to be as strategic as you can in how you work on them.
Because they then do catch up with you, when you do have those multiple things, and then you're juggling, like legit juggling. So with that, like my human was built with pretty severe ADHD. So I have to like write notes to myself all the time about where I'm at in a project, what am I, working on next, or I literally write every time I stop writing, even if it's just like to, walk the kids to the bus stop or something. Like I will forget what I was doing. And so like I write in capital letters next, so that I know what I'm doing next or what I was working on, so that I don't waste so much time. Like, what was I doing again? Which is, like a lot of, I spend a lot of my time doing that, y'all. So like as little as many times as I can like reduce the number of times I'm working through that, the better. I had something else, but it is gone.
Thank you. And yeah, I really like the idea of adding comments, because especially when you have multiple things going, it's difficult to remember where you left things off. So just having comments saying, start here now, this was your last thought when you finished writing something. I find that very helpful as well.
I remembered what it was. You brought it back. Thank you so much. It was so having the variety, I love what you put in chat, like cognitive variety is important to keep the momentum going. And that's true for your motivation. Like you need some spice, like, okay, I can't look at this anymore. But I do encourage my students when when it's on their desk to be the one that's doing the writing, is to be as single-minded in your focus as possible. So, and that doesn't mean just for like today's writing block, but just means like, okay, how many days, like when can you schedule, like when can you get it in to like have like this is the one thing you're writing? That is ideal. It's not always realistic because you might have a bunch of other things on your plate, but as much as you can to be writing on something and writing on it every day, that gets it done so much faster, even if it's only a few minutes, like 15 minutes a day that you're spending like just thinking about it like purposely, intentionally. That gets a project done so much more efficiently.
Great. I think we're at the last question, which is what are your views on the future of academic publishing, especially with Gen AI and all that fun tech stuff coming up?
Woof, I feel triggered because I feel like I'm teaching and it's just something that we're kind of trying to navigate in all aspects of our lives. So I don't have a very good answer to this, but I'll just talk about some things that I've noticed that I've noticed that some I think more and more now, within even like the last 6 months, journals have really stepped up to consider AI because I know that, you know, they're trying to put into place like so that the reviews aren't done by AI because there's some like it's just crazy to me that that would be something that someone would think would be okay, but it happens. And so how editors are approaching that, I think I don't have a crystal ball, but I suspect like so when my students turn in any assignment, I just have them fill out like this checklist of like here's all the ways I used AI. Number one, that gives them ideas of how they can effectively and ethically use AI when they're working on whatnot assignment. But I suspect, or I would be surprised at least that if we have something close to that, like how did you use AI with just the assumption that you did? Because who's not using AI right now? It's just a matter of like how you're using it and how to be ethical. And I think there are a lot of questions for a lot of folks around those two issues that I don't have answers to. Sorry. So ask ChatGPT.
Yeah, no answers.
Yeah, same.
I mean, I think, yeah, I'm trying to be as open-minded as I can about AI, but I find myself being very anxious about it and just kind of feeling like, and I mean, Sharon, you study writing, so this is something I just feel like we need to be careful about making sure it doesn't take away. Like, I feel like the writing process is so important to be done by you. Like, you need to learn how to write. Um, but as far as how it's going to change, you know, the publishing and academic publishing, I mean, I'm not sure, but I would just say if you're ever using AI, just being very careful about how you're using it, be like making sure it's very like transparent, how you're using it if you need to cite it, or explain specifically how, like, just future-proof yourself so that you're not getting in trouble later if you are using it to in any part of the kind of process. I think most journals have policies that like you can use it as long as you explain like, okay, this was the prompt I put in, or that, you know, just being very explicit. So I would just make sure to do that. But I don't really have any advice otherwise. And I don't really use it, Sharon, like at all. I don't know.
Oh.
I'm like one of the weird people that's like
Call
afraid
me.
of
I'll
it.
help you out. You should be using this on the daily. I just think it's just really tricky to know where that line is. And so there's just a lot of folks that, have a hard time figuring that out. And I think some folks aren't being very critical about it when they're writing. And to be honest, if the more you use AI, the more you can just spot it. It's just so evident. Like a human did not write this. And so I suspect that that's going to be the detectors will get better. But I feel like myself, I'm a better detector now that I use ChatGPT so often that I can spot it. They like, did you ever do this? Did you write this letter with ChatGPT? Yeah, why? Like, girl, no, we don't do that. So I find it's like it might not be the future of publishing, but it is definitely related, and it's goes back to like mentoring and getting mentorship. So if you don't know, ask how to do that. And don't expect your advisor to really know all the answers, but um, those are often questions that you can literally ask ChatGPT, and ChatGPT will actually give you a pretty good answer. So just truly, like, Katie, if you go to ChatGPT, like, hey, I'm doing this project. How could I use ChatGPT to help me? And then ChatGPT will like, 1 second, 900 ways. And like, thanks. I wouldn't even thought of those things. So like, if you don't know, ask ChatGPT and definitely have these conversations with your colleagues and your mentors, because most people are just kind of like grasping in the dark here. It's changing so fast. So no one really knows. I know that's not very helpful or terribly optimistic, but
Yeah, the only thing that I would want to add, because I agree with what everyone said, is that I do think that AI can be a helpful tool as long as you're using it um, in that way, in a tool way, so that you can do that higher level thinking. So like I was writing for a class, we were writing a systematic review, and the instructor typed into ChatGPT, like, what are the steps for writing a systematic review, and give us an outline and blah, 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 blah. And so we had that from ChatGPT, which was really nice, but we weren't inputting like, we want a systematic review on this thing, like write it for us. We were still doing the review and the higher level thinking. And I think that that was a helpful way to use it. And I mean, honestly, it was really helpful. Or things like helping you write code. I mean, it can be a really helpful tool. It's just helpful. It's important to remember that, like, yeah, we're using it and not it using us. I don't know. I kind of get freaked out about it if I think about it too much.
I love that example that you gave is of like how to use it as a tool. And I do agree that the line is the thinking, to not do the actual thinking and the scholarship part of it, what would be your contribution as a scholar. And I think that line can get fuzzy for some. And so if it's fuzzy, err on the side of being more conservative and not using it is probably the best advice.
I agree that it's a tool that makes our lives easier in certain ways. And like I use it for snappy titles. It's kind of good at that, like punchy titles. And then you generate 5, and then you pick the one that you like the best and be like, give me 5 more like this. I think that's a great way of generating some really cool titles sometimes. Yeah, so I think we're at the end. These are all the questions we had prepared for today. But if anyone in the audience has a quick question that they'd like answered in the next 4 minutes, we'd love to take that. Great example, Kimiko. I think the more you use it, the more you can sort of spot it. Yeah. I think I just had one question, and this might be too long for this, and maybe then I'm not doing a very good job as a facilitator. But when you have a writer's block, what are 3 things that you can do to overcome it?
I can start us off, and then I'm curious. I think this is really idiosyncratic, like how people get themselves out of a funk. But I have a couple ninja tricks, and the first one is I stop writing. I take my phone with me, and I go take my dog on a walk, and I I dictate into my phone what I'm thinking or what I read or why I'm stuck, or just it's so much easier than like looking at that like blinking cursor, like you don't know what you're doing, you don't know what you're doing, like dang it, you're right, cursor. So then I just get outside and get some sunshine. It's good. The dog needs walked, and I come back and I can forward my notes to my email, and look what I have. I have words, I have ideas that I can then manipulate and revise to actually move into my ideas. Granted, though, Siri thinks I mumble. I must. Siri's trying to help me right now. Don't know. No, sorry. But she thinks so I write a lot about self-efficacy, and she thinks I write about South Africa. So I just know that like every time it says South Africa, it means self-efficacy. And no shade, Siri. It's fine. We've got this relationship. The other thing I do, I swear by, is get a buddy. It is a lonely, lonely thing to write. And I think sometimes it's great to be by yourself but I think when I get stuck, I really do need a buddy. And sometimes it's just like a warm body there working on their own writing, and we're not talking about anything. It's just like they're there in their funk, and I'm here in my funk, and we're all funked, trudging through a writing together. That's helpful. And sometimes I need to actually text one of my colleagues, be like, hey, can I borrow your brain for 10 minutes? And call them. And sometimes they don't even say anything. And I'm like, oh my God, thank you so much for your help. And like, I literally didn't say anything, but they did because they were a sounding board. Last thing, if I'm not dictating on my walk, I would sometimes download the papers that I wanted to listen or I wanted to read, and then have an app read those to me while I'm on my walk. So don't forget that if you are struggling about writing, you're probably defining writing in way too narrow of terms. So writing is anything that pushes your project forward, literally anything. Reading, journaling about it, throwing things at it, like truly anything counts. It's all writing. I could go on, but I totally wrote a book about this, so I'll stop.
Great. No one has any other tips, and if you can put them in the chat while I just share my last slide, actually, to just put in a plug for our next Motivation Monday. But thank you. There we go. Great. So thank you so much for such wonderful tips. And I've been taking some furious notes, and so has Kimiko, on how to publish and write better and just like be better scholars and be self-regulated scholars who are happy about writing and publishing. Yes, thank you so much for being with us today. Our next Motivation Monday is on Feb 24th, and it's about navigating theory development and how graduate students can sort of play a role in advancing educational psychology. We also have our writing groups that meet on Tuesdays from 10 to 12. It's a great space to implement everything you learned today and all the tips you got today. So make sure you come to writing groups on Tuesdays, 10 to 12, Tuesdays 7 to 9, and Wednesdays 9 to 11. And with that, that's it. That's all we've got for today. Thank you. I did end show again and not stop sharing. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thanks for all the tips. And yeah, hang around if you have questions.
Thanks. Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks for organizing.
Yes, thank you.